Welcome to Talking Development. This is the third episode of the Concord podcast. This is a podcast by Concord Europe, the European NGO Confederation for Relief and Development. Concord represents over 2,600 NGOs throughout Europe, and together we advocate for fairer and more sustainable European policies. And today with me is Laura Sullivan, who's been involved with Concord for quite a while. But in general, you have a huge track record in the NGO world. And I hope you forgive me for consulting my notes for that. You've been working with NGOs, with trade unions, with government institutions in Brussels, in Dakar, in Lima, and in Rio for 17 years in total, which includes 10 years in Action Aid, and it includes the Concord Vice Presidency, actually, between 2014 and 2017. Now you're the director of WeMove Europe, which we will get to in a second, but I'm wondering, how do you keep yourself motivated to fight the good fight?
Yeah, great question. For me, the motivation is basically 1 part indignation and 3 parts hope, so the indignation coming from my own experience, either firsthand or reading about it, of, for example, being in Guatemala, meeting people who are working in slave-like conditions, next to no pay, terrible situation in essentially a slavery situation of producing on plantations that are producing soya for export to Europe. That model of the impact of European trade and foreign direct investment on human rights elsewhere in the world is something that really gets me going. I mean, likewise, the constant and continued existence of racism in Europe and beyond Europe, the really sort of angry and violent reaction to a lot of the climate youth as represented by Greta Thunberg and the sort of horrific responses to her, as well as the positive ones. But also, most recently seeing the panel of Spitzenkandidaten who are, supposed to be one of them will be the new representative of the European Commission and the highest level of leadership, and seeing that they are all bar one white men. And is this representative of Europe today? So this is the indignation, but the hope is the other side of that, which is the incredible movements, activists, organizations that are fighting every day for people's rights and for the continued sustainability of the planet. Meeting those movements, but also, I guess, the things that give me hope are, books like Hope in the Dark, literally says it on the cover. Amazing podcasts out there like The Guilty Feminist. I think you need to surround yourself by these sort of hopeful forms of information as well, because we are so bombarded by bad news every day that you need to know that those good stories are out there, but they don't get the oxygen.
I think you're right on, we have to remind ourselves of the success stories that we are involved with, actually. Maybe I want to touch on one point that you mentioned, which is representation and identification with politics. When I went to your website, to WeMove's website, there was one sentence in your mission that stuck with me. Saying many citizens feel powerless about decisions made by distant European institutions or by national governments convening behind closed doors. And I think this is true. But how are you trying to counteract this perception?
So, in a sense, the powerlessness that people feel about decision-making in Europe, at European level, is around how far away it seems, how complicated, sometimes how boring, dull it seems, and how difficult it seems to really get involved, how far removed it is from people's realities. So what we try to do, what we do as we move, is to connect what are really local, European and global issues, and to tell that story to people, to give them options to get involved, and to try to get people in Germany to connect with people in Spain, in Poland, in Hungary and beyond, to really shift things, because that possibility is there, but people often can't see it. So we're trying to make the power visible.
So this is all about, getting passionate people out there to participate in the political decision making. Obviously, the easiest way to participate in politics is to cast your votes. Yet, especially for European elections, it seems like we're having trouble to mobilize voters. Why do you think that is?
So voter turnout has been on a constant sort of downward spiral since 1979, since we started with these elections. And, there's a few levels there. One level is that there is general apathy with politics across the board. There are many people who don't see viable options of candidates and parties to vote for. Many don't subscribe to the hate and fear, thankfully, that is really being sort of generated by far-right movements. But many also don't sit comfortably with the policies and politics of the central parties. And so they're looking for other options. And in many cases, those options are there. And in some cases, they're not. At the European level, there is also sort of that European elections level. There's an added sort of question, which is, do people really connect with Europe? Do they feel like it links to their lives? And I would say not enough yet. We're not talking enough to make those linkages. So that's in a sense why we exist, to try to reinforce that. But there's a third level, which is at the national level, leadership and governments are not really giving Europe a very good name a lot of the time. So when good things happen at European level, the member states tend to claim it for their own sort of glory. And when bad things happen, it's blamed on Brussels, as if Brussels represents the whole EU, right? When actually a lot of the power at the EU level is those member states in the council. So, it's going to be hard for people to build that connection with Europe and that identity of Europe if you always have this thing of Europe getting the bad name for the bad stuff and the member state getting it for the good stuff. So I think a lot of this is understandable and it can change.
I think that's a good observation. It is an observation I share that, here in Brussels, of course, it's easy to argue for participation in European Parliament elections because that's our daily bread, basically. But if I go back home, I'm from the Austrian Alps, from a small town, people will talk about local politics, they will talk about national politics a lot, while EU politics is a side note. Do you have any ideas how we can, share the message to go to vote for EU elections, even in the regions?
Another really good question. So I think first is by building a sense of urgency and a sense of the potential of connectedness. So whether you're from a small town in the Alps or you're from a small village in the west of Ireland, like I am, we have to realize that there are certain things we can't change from the village level. So for example, the IPCC report that shows us we've got about a decade before we overshoot all of those boundaries and we're really in the depths of the crisis for humanity on this planet. So with that in mind, we can't shift that from Oranmore, County Galway in the west of Ireland, nor from your community in Austria. That's why we need to work together. It's the same when it comes to questions like migration. You can't shift the narrative, you can't shift the understanding of migration as essentially a good thing. From the village level. Same thing for tax havens. You're not going to shut them down from that level. So there are common cause challenges and opportunities at European level. And it's creating that urgency, helping people to understand that the worst thing we can do is just sit down. There's one last thing on that, which is really important. It's not to say you can't change anything from the local level. It's all about globalism, right? It's all about let's shift what we can at the local level. And there's plenty you can, but understanding that you have to have that connection with the national, European and global levels to really bring bigger change.
Like now we already got into the topics, the subject of things. I was wondering, I think you are the right person to ask this question to. We have been in the European election campaigns for quite a while now, and maybe you can give us a breakdown of what were the hottest topics during this.
The issues that really relate to people's local context, right? So if you go to somewhere like Ireland, the big debate right now, a big one is housing, for example, right to housing. In Romania, a big issue recently has been corruption and governance. In Germany, huge discussions around climate change. In Spain, massive conversations around feminism, around violence against women, around women's rights. So it's not to say those issues are exclusive to those countries, they cross over many. But, the real thing here is there are big European issues and there are the ones that are really local. And in a way, what we need to do more is to link the local to the European much better in terms of the stories, because Housing is a European issue. Women's rights is a European issue.
So if let's say you encounter people who raise these issues, who are saying, I'm dissatisfied with the housing situation, I want to change something about climate, yet they might be disillusioned. You might encounter a bit of apathy in people saying, I'm not going to vote, I feel like it's not changing anything. How would you respond to those kinds of people?
You can't say that the Brexit outcome, the election of Trump and so on, has not led to disillusionment. It has. It has been such a factor, and it's sort of the opposite of hope. On the other hand, these developments have led to the mass repoliticization of people, including youth. I see it in my own nieces, really with the election of Trump in particular, sort of asking the question of who is this guy and what's going on? That's really important. But also beyond the repoliticization, the sort of deeper understanding of what's happening in the world. These outcomes were shocking and yet really quite understandable because there are masses of people who do feel left behind. Because we have an economic system that means that people are losing their jobs, losing their homes, losing their hope, right? They have stagnant wages for decades, and they cannot find a way to get out of that. So the way to get out of that is to change that economic system. And unfortunately, they're being pushed in a different direction, which is pointing the finger at newcomers, at migrants, at people on the move. It's completely the wrong direction. So this is a source of disillusionment, but we can't forget the other developments, right? Look at what happened in Slovakia just recently with the election of a head of state who's talking about decency and humanity and protection of the planet. Or look at the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who's taken a completely different approach and a very human, decent approach to politics, which is really getting people talking. So those stories are there too.
Mm-hmm. That makes one feel hopeful, I think. And you mentioned the increasingly young people getting into politics, and in fact you're running an initiative called Yes to Change, where you're trying to again push people to actually sign up to vote. So you're running a pledge system where people sign and say, okay, I will vote for the European Parliament election. How is that going?
Yeah, so turnout at the elections is going downwards, and when that turnout goes down, the tendency is that the likes of far-right parties do better. So our reason for doing this is we want to say to people, the worst thing you can do is do nothing. The worst thing you can do is not vote. So we're trying to mobilize people to say no to hate and yes to change. Get out there and vote for people who care and who care about a better Europe and want to do that. So far, the reaction has been incredibly positive from other NGOs who are really supportive of this, and we're working in a massive network across Europe who have hundreds and thousands, if not millions, of members and supporters who they're in turn speaking to. And we're all together in this thing of we need to mobilize this vote. We need to get people to care and get out and vote. But we're still not seeing, let's say, enough of people signing up to our pledge. You can do it by just clicking on yes2change.eu. And also beyond signing up to the pledge, just really this week getting out there and voting and using this political expression to start to try to change things. At WeMove, we don't think elections change everything. It's one step. We need to open other ways for people to engage and change things. But this is a start. And this is how we can start on a different kind of Europe.
As you mentioned it's the first step, the EU elections. After that, it will come soon enough. We'll be back to the daily grind of making, EU policies. What would you say to those people who are about to get elected, who are about to take on their roles as MEPs, as commissioners?
I mean, you give me an opportunity to explain what do we mean when we say no to hate, yes to change? What's the change? I mean, number one is to look at the root causes of the challenges we are facing in Europe and globally. So we're taking too much of a surface approach of tweaking things here and there, rather than looking at the fact that the College of European Commissioners meets every week and makes decisions that are based on their impact on economic growth and on jobs without asking what kinds of jobs is a problem. So climate change will not go away unless we shift the economic model. And we can't shift the economic model unless we rethink what is good, what is success at European level? Like what was success for those leaders in the Commission, in the European Parliament, at the nation state level? The success must be well-being of people and well-being of planet. And it is not necessarily the case that more economic growth will create more well-being for people, because we don't have enough redistribution of the cake, of the pie, right? And it won't necessarily create it for the planet. In fact, it goes in the opposite direction, because more growth is on a collision course with nature. You know, we've seen that from the UN report that came out this week, that came out a couple of weeks ago, totally shocking, about the wiping out, the extinction of a quarter of all of our animal, flora and fauna across the planet. We're responsible for that. Those leaders that are elected now need to think about that, need to think about the IPCC report, and need to think about the fact that inequality has gone to such a bad place that even the people, that are coming to the IMF or, speaking at high levels, see the massive urgency of inequality. This is what they need to look at.
It's like plenty of reasons for us to go and vote and seek out those people whom we trust to take this on.
Absolutely.
A final question, Laura. How are you going to spend your election Sunday?
I've got to be honest. First I intend to vote. And after that, I'm co-organising a concert which will have a very European theme and a change theme here in Brussels.
Nice. Yeah. I'll sure be there.
Great.
Thank you for being on the podcast. It was delightful. And thank you all for listening and for watching Talking Development. This was the Concord podcast, and enjoy your election weekend.